Steam.
Welcome back. Many nations that have emerged from colonization, wars and failed social experiments have developed and modernized on the back of an educated population and visionary policies of their country's leaders. There may be other factors at play, but it has been found that education is the most empowering means to help citizens truly attain their potential. South Africa, despite its legacy of an inferior education because of apartheid, has failed to improve the situation for a majority of its citizens. Since 1994, the country has poured a substantial amount of money into the sector, yet results seem negligible and in some instances may have regressed. So what is the problem and how do we reverse it? Professor Jonathan Jansen is an expert in education, as a teacher, leader, and an expert, as I've said, on the subject. And he joins us to discuss this matter as well as share his experiences and ideas on how to help build a better system. Prof, pleasure to have you join us on the show. Welcome.
Pleasure's mine. Thanks, Tim.
And I notice you've gone back to your home ground now. You've just joined rejoined the University of Stellenbosch once again. What are you responsible for there?
Nothing, actually.
Can you believe it? Yeah?
It's wonderful to be a it's wonderful to be a distinguished professor there, which basically means that you can do what you want to. I think the university trusts my academic work and record and so on, and so you're given space and money and very smart students to work with, and of course it's a wonderful base for working with our schools to turn them around and to have more time to speak to our people in the 9 provinces. So that, in addition to running 3 major research programs, is what keeps me busy.
Now, when we discuss education in South Africa and the problems facing us, we're not able to just put our finger on what exactly is at the center of the problem. We've had a difficult history as far as education is concerned, but we tend to confine it only to the era of Bantu education and post-Bantu education. But just briefly, when you look back the past 100 years, what is your sense of the way education has evolved in South Africa?
Well, as you know, we have had 2 major forces impacting on the education legacy. The one, of course, is colonialism since the 17th century, and the other is, of course, specifically apartheid since 1948. And so the legacy is unmistakable and reflected in what is effectively both at the level of resourcing but also at the level of performance, 2 school systems, one that works for 20% of our children, and then the 80% are stuck in dysfunctional, mainly dysfunctional schools. And the problem that we have is that for 21 years, we haven't had a government that I believe cares enough to turn around that situation. So I'm not one who ignores the legacy that is very real. But I also think we could have done much more. I'll give you one example. In almost every one of the 9 provinces, you can, within 30 minutes of driving, go to a school that looks like what the English call an estate. Unbelievable facilities, computer laboratories, extra teachers, and so on. And 30 minutes drive later, you could be in a school where children die in pit latrines. That's unforgivable. That I cannot see how that is simply a legacy problem. That is also a problem of the failure of policy and planning since '94.
But where do you think we are getting it wrong as a society? I know you've written many critical articles on this and you've applied your mind on other aspects of education over a period of time. But let's just stay with the economics, if you will, of it, the investment in infrastructure and so on. That typically when you raise a point like the one you've just raised, the response is, anyway, we're putting more money into previously disadvantaged schools. On that basis, and maybe that basis alone, we should be credited with improving the education system. And therefore, it is unfair for a person like yourself to be critical of what has been done in improving the education situation in the country.
Right. If it was just resources, that was the argument, how much we're putting into disadvantaged schools, then of course I have no argument. But surely any country with any consciousness doesn't only look at the inputs, that is the resources coming in, but at the outputs, that is, do children in fact learn more and better as a result of what we do with resources? Now, we know that's not true. We know that almost in every international test of achievement, we are either dead last or second last. Countries like Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Botswana, all perform better than South Africa, despite the fact that we spend more money on per capita on the education of children, whether it's as a percentage of GDP or as a slice of the national budget. So the problem isn't money. The problem is translating those resources into results, and there we have failed dismally. Now, I've thought about this problem for a very long time, as you know, with you and others, and I used to think it was the resources. I used to think maybe if we just had more money and spent it better, we'd get the problem solved. I have come to the conclusion that the reason we're stuck has to do with a complete collapse in the moral responsibility, that sense of responsibility, of ownership for the welfare of every child. Let me put it to you this way. How does a cabinet minister sleep at night, okay, when you know that your own child is in a fancy former Model C school or in a private school, and the children of everybody else is in a township rural school with all this disadvantage? How do you sleep at night? I believe that if you had public servants who understood deeply that there is a value system that should drive us, the stuff you read in the Constitution around dignity and freedom and so on and so forth, then I think we can overcome these problems. But there's not a day that goes by, as you know, in our country where there isn't yet another report of people stealing, of wholesale corruption within the state. So I think what we've lost is not so much the ability to, you know, give a slice of the budget to education. What we've lost is an urgency, a sense of commitment, a sense of my child is not safe until everybody's child is safe. Just imagine that principle guided every action of our government. We'd have a very different set of outcomes. But because we're selfish, we're tribal, we care for our own, we really don't care about the child who drowns in human excrement. We don't care. And so I think we've got a bigger problem here than resources, and that is what I call the sort of failure of moral responsibility.
Sure. But here's the point, Prof. Just to pick up on a point you made earlier on, that because we're tribal, we're selfish, we're regional, and all of that. Why does it happen? I'm just citing an example that you find in the Western Cape. The approach to education is slightly different, and it appears to be better than the approach and the resourcing for education in the Eastern Cape, for instance. They sit side by side. They're neighbors as provinces in the country. Why do you think that is the case?
Let's keep both these things in play. The historical picture we have to keep in play, that provinces like Gauteng and the Western Cape have relative advantage from the past.
Yes.
But don't let the Western Cape people fool you into thinking that all the schools are working here. It's not. Even as we speak, okay, there are 4,000 people right now who have been displaced in Khayelitsha as a result of a fire that started there because people live in the most atrocious, kinds of living conditions and so on and so forth. That's in the Western Cape. That's in my province. Okay.
Yep.
So don't be fooled by the fact that the inequality itself is a consequence, again, of relative advantage compared to the Eastern Cape, where you had a whole lot of so-called homelands, as you know, with their own deprivations. So my point simply is this, Tim. It is not good enough to point to the few that do well. Our responsibility is to the many who don't.
Yeah, but the question is that in the Eastern Cape, for instance, the schools or money budgeted for the schools to be built apparently is not used for that purpose. and probably, you know, elsewhere, not only in the Western Cape, that money, let me use Gauteng, for instance. They talk mostly of launching a school every month, and they are proud of the fact that they've been doing this for the past. Of course, the resources are there, but in the Eastern Cape, what do you think is going on when the money is budgeted for, but it's never used for that purpose?
No, let's talk about the Eastern Cape then as a specific case in point. It is by far, you know, the most dysfunctional province outside of KwaZulu-Natal and Mpumalanga. It is very dysfunctional when it comes to education. You have a terrible legacy of the homelands, and you have corruption in the presence. You know, if you just take a fairly sophisticated metro like the Nelson Mandela Bay Metro, you know, municipality. I mean, here you have a place in which people steal openly. People used to be, embarrassed when they steal. Now they steal openly. If you don't believe this, read a book called How to Steal a City, and then follow it up with How to Steal a Country, you know. But the How to Steal a City is really about Port Elizabeth. And so on. So you can blame the past till you're blue in the face. At the end of the day, you also have to ask, with the money you're given in the Eastern Cape, why is there so much corruption, you know, certainly relative to some of the other provinces, and why is there no accountability back to government? Now, my argument is that under President Ramaphosa or under President Zuma, I don't care who the president was, why were they not able to break the back of corruption? Why were they not able to say to the unions, yes, you are there in a democracy responsible for teachers, but you are also not to stand in the way of the progress of children in the poorest schools? Have you ever seen a union, the majority union, disrupt Grey High School in PE, or Westerwood High School in Cape Town, or Rodin in Johannesburg? No, they disrupt the schools of the children of the poor. That is not a union problem. Ultimately, it's a political problem. And why have we not intervened in order to solve that problem? So again, both things are in play, the past and the present, but I want to talk about what we're doing with the resources we do have, with the opportunities available to us, because it's been more than 2 decades and people are rightfully angry that we're stuck.
Professor Jonathan Jansen is my guest here on the Modise Network. You too can join our conversation on social media. Use the hashtag the Modise Network, and we will be focusing on tertiary education in a moment. Don't go away.